Hey guys, tonight we're climbing aboard one of the most romantic, celebrated and catastrophically uncomfortable conveyances in American history, the Oregon Trail Wagon. Not the video game version where you cheerfully name your oxen and then watch them die of dysentery. I mean the actual wagon, a 6-foot wooden box on wheels, packed with everything you owned, rolling slowly through 800 miles of mud, mountains and deeply justified regret. So before we go any further, a huge thank you to the viewer who suggested this one. You know who you are. And I hope you're comfortable right now, because the people we're talking about tonight were absolutely not. If you enjoy what I do here, please like the video and subscribe, but only if it genuinely makes your evenings a little stranger and a little more historically specific. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. It is always 2 in the morning somewhere. And if you're a Spotify person, we're over there too. Links in the description, right between the wagon grease and the hardtack recipes. Now dim those lights, turn on a fan, pull your blanket up, stretch out on your soft, motionless, stationary bed, and let's take a moment to truly appreciate that you are not currently in a covered wagon. Because here's what I want you to think about tonight. Have you ever wondered what it actually felt like to pack your entire life into a space roughly the size of a large walk-in closet, and then spend 4 to 6 months bouncing across the continent? What did people eat out there when the food ran out on week 3? Where did you go to the bathroom? What happened when it rained for 2 weeks straight, and everything you owned was wet, including the children? Did anyone ever look back? Did anyone ever look at the wagon and think, maybe the thing I was fleeing wasn't so bad after all? Was there a moment, somewhere in present-day Wyoming, surrounded by broken axles and furious oxen, when someone just sat down in the dirt and refused to move? Congratulations, you've just woken up in 1848 on the outskirts of Independence, Missouri. Your wagon is packed, your oxen are named, your neighbors are annoyingly optimistic. The trail stretches 2,000 miles in front of you, and someone just told you it'll only take 5 months. It won't. Let's start before the wagon, before the mud, before the moment you deeply regretted all of your decisions. Let's start with why you went. Because no one woke up one morning in 1845 and said, I simply must cross a mountain range in a wooden box. There was a reason, and usually it wasn't a good one. For most emigrants heading west on the Oregon Trail between the early 1840s and the late 1860s, the decision to leave came from a familiar cocktail of desperation, bad luck, and extremely effective propaganda. Newspapers and pamphlets promised free land, fertile soil, and a fresh start so vivid and glowing that you'd almost forget the part where they neglected to mention the cholera. The economic panic of 1837 had flattened large parts of the American Midwest. Banks failed. Farms failed. The kind of slow, grinding financial pressure that makes a man stare out a window and start thinking seriously about reinvention had settled over entire communities like weather. And then the pamphlets arrived, published by land speculators, missionary societies, and enthusiastic journalists who had never personally crossed a desert. They described Oregon's Willamette Valley in terms so extravagant that they bordered on fiction. Rich black soil, mild winters, forests full of timber, land, enormous quantities of it, just waiting to be claimed by anyone willing to walk there and ask for it. You read those pamphlets, you read them more than once, you pass them to your wife, who read them with the careful expression of someone identifying the thing that is about to change her life against her better judgment. Your neighbors were talking about it. A family 3 farms over had already sold everything and left for Independence, Missouri, the jumping-off point for the trail. The wheat hadn't come in well for the 2nd year running, and the roof needed repair, and the banknote was not going to resolve itself by optimism alone. So you started doing the math. Not the real math, not the math that accounted for the cost of outfitting a wagon, the 5-month journey, The first winter in a territory with no infrastructure and no neighbours you knew. The other math. The math that said, if things stay as they are, what does this look like in 10 years? And the answer, in 1845 in a struggling Midwestern farming community, was not encouraging. It wasn't only financial. Some people left for health reasons. The Mississippi Valley was malaria country, and Oregon's climate was said to be cleaner, drier, and less aggressively interested in killing you. Some people left for religious reasons, following missionaries who had gone ahead and sent back letters describing a spiritual frontier waiting to be cultivated alongside the agricultural one. Some people left because their families were going, and the alternative was staying behind alone, which in the social architecture of 1845 was not really an alternative at all. Some people left because they were young enough to believe that the distance between where they were and where they could be was something you could simply walk across, and that on the other side of all that effort was a version of your life that actually worked. That particular belief has never gone out of fashion. It is perhaps the most American belief there is. And so, somewhere between desperation and hope, between a bad harvest and a glowing pamphlet, between a conversation by the fire and a handshake with a wagon seller in Missouri, you made the decision. You were going to Oregon. You were going to pack everything you owned into a 10-foot wooden box and walk 2,000 miles through weather and terrain that had no particular interest in your survival. You were going to do it because staying felt impossible, and because the human capacity for optimism in the face of very strong evidence to the contrary is, it turns out, essentially limitless. You left, and you didn't look back. Not yet, anyway. Before you could suffer, you had to equip yourself to suffer properly. Choosing the right wagon was the single most consequential purchase an emigrant family would ever make, and most of them made it under enormous time pressure with limited funds from salesmen in Missouri who were not exactly operating under a strict honesty policy. The standard vehicle of choice was the farm wagon, not the famous Conestoga, which was too heavy and too large for the trail, but a lighter, plainer prairie schooner, roughly 10 feet long, 4 feet wide, and about as aerodynamic as a barn door. It would carry everything. You owned everyone in your family and all of your hopes for a better life across 2,000 miles of terrain that had absolutely no interest in your hopes. The prairie schooner earned its poetic name from its white canvas cover, which billowed in the wind and gave the wagon trains a nautical, almost graceful appearance from a distance. Up close, it was considerably less romantic. The wagon bed was a plain wooden box, sealed with tar or pitch along the joints to make it waterproof enough to float across shallow rivers, in theory. The wheels were enormous, the back ones often 5 feet tall, constructed from hardwoods like oak and hickory, because those were the woods least likely to crack under sustained punishment. The canvas cover was stretched over a series of bent wooden boughs, and was your only protection from sun, rain, and the fact that you were sleeping in it for 5 months. You stood in the wagon yard in Independence or St. Joseph, Missouri, surrounded by noise and the smell of sawdust and livestock and competing salesmen, and you tried to make a rational decision. This was difficult because you had probably never bought a wagon before, had no reliable way of assessing quality, and were being told by everyone that you absolutely had to leave by early May or risk catching the mountain passes in the first autumn snows, which created a sense of urgency that was commercially convenient for the people selling wagons. The price was somewhere between $80 and $100 for a decent wagon, a significant sum in 1848, roughly 2 months of wages for a working man, assuming you'd been earning wages, which many emigrants no longer were. You inspected the wheels, you tested the joints, you poked the woodwork with the expression of someone who knew what they were looking for, but wasn't entirely certain what that was. The salesman assured you it was the finest wagon in Missouri. He said this to everyone. Then there were the upgrades to consider. a wagon cover treated with linseed oil for better waterproofing, reinforced wheel hubs, a toolbox bolted to the side for easy access, a water barrel mounted on the exterior. Every addition cost money, and every addition also added weight, and weight was the enemy of the oxen, who were the engine of the entire enterprise. Every extra pound you put on the wagon was a pound the oxen had to pull across the Rocky Mountains, which was a useful way of thinking about it, and which most people did not fully internalize until somewhere around week 6. You bought the wagon, you felt good about it for approximately 3 days, until you started loading it, and discovered that everything you owned weighed considerably more than the wagon was designed to carry, and that you were going to have to make some decisions about what you truly needed versus what you merely loved. This, it turned out, was excellent emotional preparation for the rest of the journey. You had a wagon, you had a list, you had approximately 1,000 pounds of things you were convinced were essential, and approximately 500 pounds of space to put them in. The recommended supply list for an Oregon Trail emigrant was a masterpiece of optimism. 200 pounds of flour per adult, 30 pounds of hardtack, 75 pounds of bacon, 10 pounds of salt, 20 pounds of sugar, a coffee grinder, tools, medicine, rope, blankets, spare wagon parts, cooking equipment, and whatever personal effects you couldn't imagine living without. What the list didn't tell you was that by the time you hit the Rocky Mountains, you'd be throwing furniture, iron stoves, and beloved family heirlooms off the back of the wagon to save the oxen. The trail was famously littered with the abandoned possessions of people who had packed too hopefully and learned too late. The packing started weeks before departure and immediately revealed the gap between what you needed to survive and what you had spent the last decade accumulating. You started with the food, hundreds of pounds of it, which was non-negotiable because there were no grocery stores between Missouri and Oregon, a statement so obvious it shouldn't need saying, and yet somehow still surprised people when they fully internalized it. The flour went in first, in cloth sacks nested in waterproof barrels. The bacon was packed in brine or nested in bran to slow the rancidity that would eventually claim it anyway. The coffee was rationed and guarded. People got very protective about the coffee. Then the tools, an axe, a hammer, a saw, a shovel, spare bolts and nails, a hunting rifle, ammunition, a cast iron skillet, a Dutch oven, wooden bowls and spoons, a tin coffee pot, rope in quantities that seemed excessive until they weren't, medicines, laudanum for pain, quinine for fever, castor oil for the digestive consequences of trail food, camphor, plasters, bandages, a small chest of personal documents, deeds, letters, the deed to the land you were hoping to claim on the other end, seeds for the farm you were going to plant, a Bible, and then the personal things, the chair your grandmother left you, the small clock from the mantelpiece, the iron stove you'd saved up for 2 years to buy, the children's books, the extra dresses, the wool rug from the parlour, the wedding portrait, the second best set of dishes. You told yourself these things were practical. You told yourself you couldn't leave them. You fit them in around the flour barrels and told yourself it would be fine. It was not fine. By the time you reached Fort Laramie, roughly 600 miles into the journey, your oxen were labouring visibly on the hills. Experienced frontiersmen at the fort watched you come in and began the quiet, charitable assessment of which of your possessions were making it to Oregon and which were staying in Wyoming. Trail veterans called this the Great Abandonment, though emigrants in the moment used other words. And so the roadside filled up. Iron stoves first, too heavy, too large, immediately expendable once the reality of the mountains became concrete. Then furniture, the rocking chair, the bureau, the chest of drawers, dishes, extra clothing, the rug, the clock maybe. The things that had felt essential in Missouri and felt impossible in the Rockies. Future emigrants coming along weeks later found the trail lined with the domestic debris of everyone who had come before them. A kind of open-air museum of other people's optimism and hard choices. Some items were taken by the people who found them, recycled back into service by someone who either had a lighter load or had already abandoned their own equivalent. Others just sat there on the roadside and slowly became part of the landscape. You tried not to think about the chair. You mostly succeeded. Let's talk about the real MVPs of the entire operation. Your oxen, not your horses, not your mules. Your oxen, slow, enormous, magnificently stubborn animals who were, against all odds, the single best choice for pulling a loaded wagon across a continent. Horses were faster but fragile, prone to injury and poor on the sparse trail grass. Mules were clever but temperamental, with a refined sense of what they were and were not willing to do. Oxen were steadier, stronger, cheaper to buy, and able to survive on grass alone when the feed ran out, which it did. Most emigrant families hitched 2 to 3 pairs of oxen to their wagon, gave them names, usually something like Bright, Buck or Ben, and then spent the next 5 months in a complicated emotional relationship with them that oscillated between deep gratitude and barely suppressed fury. A good yoke of oxen in 1848 cost somewhere between $25 and $50 a pair, which made them meaningfully cheaper than horses and significantly cheaper than the mules that army freighters preferred. You bought them from dealers in Missouri who ranged in their honesty, inspected their feet and their eyes, and tried to assess their temperament, which was easier said than done because all oxen look fundamentally calm until they don't. You needed at least 4, ideally 6 or even 8, because the mountain stretches required doubling or tripling the team on the steeper grades, and because some animals were not going to make it to Oregon and you needed reserves. Oxen were managed with a yoke, a wooden bar that rested across their shoulders, connecting the 2 animals of each pair so they pulled in concert. Learning to handle a yoke team was a skill that farm-raised emigrants had some head start on, and everyone else acquired through a painful process of trial, error, and being dragged sideways through creek beds. The commands were simple: G for right, haw for left, whoa for stop, but the animal's willingness to follow those commands depended heavily on their mood, the terrain, the weather, and a complex inner life that oxen were not interested in explaining to you. They were extraordinarily patient for most of the journey, which was both their greatest virtue and the thing that made it easy to push them too hard without realizing it. An ox in distress doesn't complain in ways that are easy to read. They slow down, gradually, until one day they simply stop. On the high desert of present-day Idaho, where the grass was overgrazed and the distances between water were measured in days, teams that had been solid and reliable for 1,000 miles began to break down with a quiet inevitability that trail journals record with great sadness. Emigrants who had been farmers all their lives understood what they were looking at. Those who hadn't had to learn fast. The most durable bond of the Oregon Trail was frequently the one between a family and their lead pair. The 2 animals at the front of the team, the ones who set the pace and absorbed the first shock of difficult terrain. Diaries record names with the same frequency and affection as they record the names of human companions. The death of a lead ox was a genuine crisis, practically because replacing a trained animal mid-trail was expensive and difficult, emotionally because 5 months of shared hardship produces a relationship with any creature that endures it alongside you. They got you there, most of them. Thinner than they'd started, footsore, depleted in ways that a winter in the Willamette Valley could only partially restore. They did not get a pamphlet about what they were signing up for. They did not have the option of turning back. They pulled and pulled and pulled through mud and sand and mountain passes, and they asked for nothing except grass and water and the occasional absence of a particularly steep hill. They deserved better. They got Oregon. Every morning on the Oregon Trail started the same way. Too early, too cold, and without coffee for at least the first hour. Camp was typically broken at 4 in the morning. Not 4 in the morning as a metaphor, literally before the sun had decided to participate in the day. While the ground was still damp and the oxen were still deeply uninterested in moving, someone had to rekindle the fire, someone had to boil water, someone had to wrangle the animals, pack the wagon, tend to the children, and produce something approximating breakfast, all before the wagon master gave the signal to move out, which he would do whether you were ready or not. The trail didn't wait. The weather didn't wait. The cholera certainly didn't wait. Morning on the Oregon Trail was less of a routine and more of a controlled emergency. The 4 o'clock wake-up was not arbitrary cruelty, though it felt like it. The logic was sound and straightforward. Teams needed to cover their miles during the cooler hours of morning before the heat of midday depleted the animals, before the afternoon could produce the storms that swept across the plains with very little warning and even less sympathy. The trail's usable window was roughly 6 in the morning to noon, a rest through the hottest hours if the animals needed it, and then another push in the late afternoon until the light failed. To hit those windows, you had to start before they opened. So you woke up in the dark. If you'd been sleeping in the wagon, you extracted yourself from the tangle of bedding and supplies and children with the careful movements of someone who understood that waking a child before sunrise on the Oregon Trail was an experience no one needed. If you'd been sleeping in a tent, you crawled out onto grass still wet with dew and stood up in the cold morning air and thought briefly about every decision that had led to this moment. The fire came first. Whatever you had banked from the night before, if there was wood, and on the treeless plains there often wasn't, because the trail had used up the convenient timber, and you were now burning dried buffalo dung, which worked but produced a specific aromatic experience that you adapted to faster than you expected needed to be coaxed back to life. Water from the barrel or the nearest stream went into the coffee pot. The coffee pot was the most important object in camp and was treated accordingly. While water heated, the animals were gathered from wherever they had grazed during the night. They were hobbled or corralled, but never perfectly contained, and the complex process of yoking the teams began. Oxen that had been willing and cooperative the day before sometimes developed overnight opinions about the yoke that required considerable negotiation. This negotiation happened in the dark, in the cold, on ground that may have been muddy, and it was conducted by people who had been awake for approximately 15 minutes and were running on the memory of coffee. Breakfast, such as it was, happened simultaneously or not at all. Cornmeal mush cooked in the skillet, leftover bread from the night before, salt pork fried over the fire, eaten standing up or crouched near the wagon, or handed to children still half asleep and walking, because by the time breakfast was ready, the camp was already moving and you ate on the way, or you went hungry until noon. By the time the sun actually appeared on the horizon, you were already moving. The wagon was packed, the fire was cold, and there was nothing left behind to indicate you had been there at all, just a ring of ash and a patch of flattened grass, and the ruts left by your wheels joining the ruts left by everyone who had come before you. One more morning done. Only about 150 more to go. Food on the Oregon Trail was not a pleasure. It was a logistical problem that happened to occasionally taste like something. Breakfast was typically cornmeal mush or fried salt pork, and whatever bread you could manage to produce without an oven, which was a lot harder than it sounds when you're crouching over an open fire at dawn. Lunch was rarely a formal event. Most wagon trains kept moving through midday, so you ate while walking, hardtack, dried beef, maybe a handful of dried fruit if you were doing well on supplies. Dinner was the main meal, and even that was a negotiation between what you had, what the fire would cooperate with, and how exhausted you were after 12 miles of walking through dust. By the second month, the bacon was going rancid. By the third, the flour was full of weevils. By the fourth, nobody was complaining about the weevils anymore. Hardtack deserves its own paragraph because it was the most constant, most enduring, most philosophically exhausting food on the trail. A simple flour and water cracker baked until all moisture had been thoroughly driven out. Hardtack was specifically designed to last indefinitely. which it did, because nothing that lives in a hardtack cracker can survive the experience. It had the texture of a paving stone and the flavour of flower-scented determination. You ate it softened in coffee if you had coffee. You ate it soaked in water if you didn't. You ate it straight when you were past caring, which happened faster than you'd think. The bacon situation evolved in predictable stages. In the first weeks it was genuinely edible, salty, dense, fried in the skillet each morning with the particular sizzling authority of a food that knows it is carrying the nutritional weight of an entire enterprise. By the middle of the journey, the summer heat had begun its work on the salted pork. Trail diaries from emigrant women in particular contain vivid and extremely specific descriptions of bacon that had crossed whatever line exists between preserved and something else. You ate it anyway. You ate it because it was fat and protein, and the trail required both, and because the alternative was not eating, which had its own consequences. Game supplemented the diet when it could be had, and in the early stretches of the trail, across the Great Plains where buffalo still roamed in numbers that were extraordinary even to people who had grown up with large animals, fresh meat was occasionally abundant. Hunters rode out from the wagon train each morning, and a successful hunt meant fresh buffalo or antelope or prairie chicken for the whole company, which was genuinely celebratory. The smell of fresh meat cooking over a campfire after 2 weeks of fried salt pork and cornmeal had the quality of a small miracle. But game became scarcer as the trail moved west and the terrain became more demanding, and the hunters had to range further and return with less. Wild plants filled occasional gaps. Emigrants learned from native communities and from each other which berries were edible and which weren't, which greens could be boiled and which would make you regret the experiment. Wild onions, service berries, watercress near streams. These were supplements, not substitutes, but in the second half of the journey when scurvy began appearing in trains that had been eating nothing but preserved food for months, a handful of fresh, wild greens had a nutritional urgency that went beyond preference. Coffee was the emotional spine of the whole operation, valued with an intensity that transcended caffeine. The evening fire and the morning pot were the 2 points of the day that felt most like normalcy, and the coffee that went with them, bitter, strong, boiled in a tin pot over a fire of whatever was available, was the closest thing the trail had to comfort. When trains ran out of coffee, trail journals register the event with the gravity usually reserved for deaths and river disasters. It was, for many emigrants, the hardest deprivation of the whole journey. You got to Oregon not because the food sustained you in any comfortable way, but because the human body is more patient with its own mistreatment than it has any right to be. You arrived thinner than you left, and significantly more opinionated about bacon. Here is something the Oregon Trail mythology somehow leaves out. You didn't ride in the wagon. Almost nobody rode in the wagon. The wagon was for supplies, not passengers, and even if there had been room, the ride was so violent, so relentlessly jolting over unpaved terrain, that most emigrants reported that walking alongside it was significantly more comfortable than sitting inside it. And so you walked. Adults walked, teenagers walked, children who were old enough to keep up walked, and the elderly and the very young rode and tried not to be thrown out on the particularly aggressive stretches. The average wagon train covered 12 to 15 miles a day. Over 5 months, that was somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 miles on foot, in shoes that were not designed for this. Let's be specific about the shoes, because the shoes are important. Most emigrant men wore leather boots, reasonably sturdy at departure, and progressively less so for the rest of the journey. Women wore leather shoes with low heels and thin soles. Children wore whatever fit. None of these were walking. Shoes in the modern sense, there were no walking shoes in the modern sense, and none of them were designed for the particular variety of terrain the trail provided. Deep prairie mud that sucked at every step, rocky river crossings that bruised through leather, sharp desert gravel that wore through soles by the time you hit present-day Wyoming. Resoling shoes on the trail required either a cobbler in the party, which some trains had, or the raw improvisation that became the trail's defining skill set. Blisters were universal. Every trail journal mentions blisters at some point, usually in passing, because blisters were so constant and so thoroughly accepted as the baseline condition of existence that they barely warranted extended comment. You walked on blisters. You wrapped them in whatever cloth was available and kept going, because the alternative was riding in the wagon, which meant someone else was walking alongside it and there was an unspoken social contract on the trail about who rode and who walked that most emigrants honoured out of sheer communal fairness. The walking itself had its own rhythms. The morning hours before the heat built were the easiest. The legs still had some memory of rest. The air was cool, and the landscape ahead had not yet resolved into its full monotonous expanse. By mid-morning the pattern of the day was established. Wagon, dust, grass, sky, walking. The same wagon in front of you all day. The same sounds, the creaking of the wheels, the rhythmic breathing of the oxen, the voices of people nearby, the particular silence that settles over large groups when everyone has been awake since 4 and used up their conversation by 10. Children, surprisingly, fared reasonably well at the walking, at least the older ones. They had energy the adults had already spent, and the trail, for a child of 8 or 10, had a quality of sustained adventure that the adults experienced differently. They ranged ahead and behind the wagon, explored the edges of the trail, collected rocks and bones and interesting pieces of the landscape, and generally treated the whole enterprise as an extremely long and geographically ambitious walk with their family, which it was. They also, on long flat stretches of the Plat River Road with nothing whatsoever to see in any direction, got bored with an intensity that only children can achieve, and expressed this freely. By the end of the day, when the wagon master finally called the halt and the wagons circled for camp, the physical sensation of stopping was almost disorienting. Legs that had been moving since before sunrise registered the stillness with a kind of confused relief. You sat down on the wagon step or a rock or the bare ground and your feet told you things about themselves that you hadn't wanted to hear. And then someone handed you coffee and you drank it and you looked at how far you'd come that day. 12 miles, maybe 15 if it had been a good day, and you did the arithmetic about how many more days like this remained, and you went to sleep, and in the morning you stood up and did it again. Let's talk about the inside of the wagon. Which is to say, let's talk about your home for the next 5 months. It was approximately 10 feet long and 4 feet wide, which is roughly the size of a large bathroom or a very small studio apartment, if your studio apartment had no insulation, no windows, no floor except the wagon bed, and was also violently in motion for 12 hours a day. Into this space you packed all of your food, your tools, your medicine, your spare clothing, your bedding, your cooking equipment, your seeds for the farm you were going to have, your children's toys, your family Bible, and the hope that sustained you through everything that came next. By week 3, it looked like a warehouse had collapsed inside a moving closet. By week 8, it smelled like it too. Organisation was attempted. Most emigrant women, and it was almost always, the women who organised the interior, developed a system in the first weeks of travel, assigning specific areas of the wagon bed to specific categories of need. Food supplies went in the back, heaviest items at the bottom. Bedding was layered on top of the food barrels so it could be accessed at night without unpacking everything. Tools hung from hooks on the interior bows. Medicine and anything that needed to stay dry was packed in the centre and elevated. Small children were assigned a spot that was theoretically theirs, and actually wherever they ended up. This system lasted until the first major river crossing, when everything shifted, slid or toppled, and the reorganisation that followed was less systematic and more philosophical. After a few weeks on the trail, the interior of a wagon ceased to be organised in any deliberate sense, and became instead a settled ecosystem of everything you owned. arranged by the organic logic of what had been needed most recently. The smell deserves acknowledgement. Canvas is not airtight. The interior of the wagon retained the combined fragrance of salted meat, damp wool, unwashed bodies, the particular tang of iron and wood and grease from the tools, coffee grounds, horse liniment, and whatever the trail itself had contributed by way of dust and mud, and the general atmospheric ambience of 5 months in the open air. You stopped noticing it, which was its own kind of mercy, the same way you stop noticing the background noise of your own house, until a guest arrives and their face tells you something you hadn't considered. At night, if you slept in the wagon, which depended on weather, space, and personal preference, you arranged the bedding over the cargo and slept in whatever configuration your family geometry allowed. For a couple with young children, this meant an intimate puzzle of limbs and blankets, and the ongoing midnight negotiation of who was touching whom and whether that was intentional. For a solo emigrant or a couple without children, it was marginally more spacious, though still emphatically not comfortable. The wagon bed was hard. The cargo underneath the bedding was lumpy in ways that became personally familiar by the second week. The canvas overhead let in cold air along the edges and sometimes, if the weather was bad, let in water along the same channels. And yet there was something about the interior of a wagon at night, lamp guttered down and a rain on the canvas, that was its own specific kind of shelter. Not comfortable, not quiet, not warm enough, but enclosed, defined. A space that was yours in a landscape that offered no other kind of privacy whatsoever. Emigrant diaries occasionally note this with a kind of surprised gratitude. The wagon, for all its miseries, was home in the only sense that mattered on the trail, which was that it was the place you came back to every night, regardless of what the day had produced. That counted for something. It counted for more than you would have expected back in Missouri when you first looked at it and thought it seemed small. Dry conditions on the Oregon Trail were miserable. Wet conditions were something else entirely. When it rained, and across 2,000 miles of open country, it rained with frequency and enthusiasm, the trail transformed from a dusty rut into something closer to a slow-moving river of brown soup. Wagon wheels sank. Oxen slipped. The trail disappeared entirely in some stretches, and wagon masters had to make judgment calls about which direction probably led somewhere. Everything inside the wagon got wet. The blankets, the flour, the hardtack, the letters home that you were composing in your head. Everything on your body got wet too, and then stayed wet for days, because the sun was not always available for consultation. Wet clothes, wet boots, wet firewood that refused to ignite no matter how desperately you needed it to. The rain turned the trail from an adventure into a long, soggy argument with nature. The mud of the Great Plains was not ordinary mud. It was a specific, ambitious mud with aspirations, sticky, dense, and with a particular suction cup quality that grabbed wagon wheels at the axle and held them with the conviction of something that had been practicing. Teams that were pulling smoothly on dry ground suddenly found themselves straining at a near standstill in mud that came up to the wheel hubs, and the sound of oxen working against it, that deep, laboured bellowing, hooves churning, was one of the more distressing sounds the trail produced. Getting a wagon out of deep mud required everyone, every adult pushing from behind, every available piece of timber wedged under the wheels, every animal straining in the traces, and a significant quantity of words that would not have been approved by the local church. Your clothing, which had been merely uncomfortable in dry conditions, became a separate problem in rain. Wool, which most emigrants wore because it was warm and affordable, retained moisture with enthusiasm and dried with extreme reluctance. A wool dress or coat soaked through in a morning rainstorm might still be damp 3 days later if the sun didn't cooperate, which in the spring and early summer sections of the trail it frequently didn't. You walked in wet shoes that rubbed new blisters over the old ones. You sat in wet clothes on wet wagon seats and told yourself this was temporary. Fire was the cruelest casualty of sustained rain. On the treeless plains, where fuel was already a challenge and emigrants relied on dried buffalo dung called chips, in the polite language of trail journals, wet weather rendered the chips useless. Wet chips produce smoke without heat, which was a perfect metaphor for the whole enterprise but not useful for cooking dinner. Families who had planned carefully might have a small reserve of actual wood carried in the wagon for exactly this circumstance, but that reserve went fast and after it was gone, and dinner was cold, or dinner was whatever didn't require cooking, or dinner was the grim experience of eating hardtack in a wet wagon, while rain hammered the canvas 6 inches above your head. The psychological toll of sustained bad weather on the trail was real and documented. Trail journals shift in tone during long rainy stretches. The dry wit and careful optimism that characterize the early entries give way to something flatter, more functional, less interested in the scenery. You noted the miles covered and the miles remaining, and the state of the animals and the state of the food supply, and you did not editorialize about the beauty of the prairie, because the prairie was currently trying to drown you, and you were not feeling charitable about it. And then the sun came back. It always came back eventually, and when it did, when the trail dried and the grass steamed in the morning light and the oxen moved freely again, and the fire caught on the first try, the relief was physical, immediate and genuine. The wet misery of the preceding days receded into something almost funny in retrospect. Almost. You wrung out the bedding. You hung the wool to dry on the wagon bows. You ate a hot dinner for the first time in 4 days and felt, briefly but sincerely, that everything was going to be all right. It rained again the following Tuesday. If the mud was a nuisance, the rivers were a genuine threat, and there were many rivers. The Kansas, the Plat, the Snake, the Green. The Oregon Trail crossed or followed major waterways throughout its entire length, and each crossing was its own small crisis. Some rivers had ferries, usually a flatboat operated by an enterprising frontiersman or a local native community, for a fee that felt reasonable until you'd paid it 12 times in a row. Some rivers had fords, shallow enough in theory, though theory and the actual depth of a river in spring runoff had a complicated relationship. And some rivers had neither, and you simply had to make your best guess and push the wagon in and hope. Wagons tipped, animals panicked, people drowned. The Green River alone cost multiple emigrant trains' lives every year, and yet the crossing continued, because the alternative was stopping, and stopping was not the plan. The ferry crossing was the easiest option and also the most expensive. Operators charged by the wagon, by the animal, sometimes by the person, and they charged what the market would bear, which in the case of a wagon train that had no alternative whatsoever was a great deal. Emigrants complained about ferry fees in their diaries with the specific outrage of people who know they're being overcharged and are going to pay anyway. The ferries themselves range from solid, well-built flatboats managed by experienced operators to arrangements that were optimistic at best and alarming at worst. A raft of lashed logs guided by a rope strung across the current, requiring everyone aboard to breathe shallowly and not think too hard about the mathematics of buoyancy. The ford crossing required reconnaissance. Before committing the wagons to the water, experienced emigrants or the wagon master would ride across on horseback first, reading the bottom. Gravel was good, mud was not. Hidden drop-offs were the particular nightmare that trail veterans mentioned with the emphasis of personal experience. If the water was below the wagon bed, you crossed. If it was above, you either found a better spot, waited for the water level to drop, or made the decision that you had no better options and crossed anyway, with the wagon bed sealed as best you could manage, and everything important elevated above the waterline, and everyone aboard holding their breath. Even successful crossings were not peaceful. The current pushed against the wagon broadside, trying to rotate it downstream. Oxen entering cold water sometimes balked, sometimes panicked, and occasionally simply turned around mid-river with the wagon, attached, which created a situation that required all available humans and a great deal of focused problem-solving to resolve. Wheels found unexpected holes in the riverbed. The wagon tilted. Things that had been secured shifted. Water came in over the sides, regardless of how well you had sealed the joints. Drowning deaths on the Oregon Trail are documented in trail journals, at river crossings, with a regularity that makes them one of the trail's most consistent dangers. Children fell from wagons mid-crossing. Men who tried to swim alongside to steady the wheels were pulled under by the current. Horses and mules that panicked and tried to turn created cascading disasters that capsized wagons and swept supplies downstream. After each drowning, the train stopped. Graves were dug on the far bank if the body was recovered, a brief service was held, and the train moved on. There was no other option. There was never any other option. The far bank, once reached, was always a victory, and trail journals register it as one. The wagons dripping on solid ground, the animals shaking themselves dry, the inventory of what had been lost versus what had made it, and then, before anything had really dried, the wagons were moving again, because the trail didn't stop for river crossings any more than it stopped for anything else. The river was behind you. The next one was somewhere ahead, waiting. This segment is about something that virtually every history book about the Oregon Trail skips entirely, and yet it was a pressing concern for every man, woman and child who ever travelled it. Where, exactly, do you go to the bathroom? The answer, if you're hoping for something reassuring, is not reassuring. The trail was a treeless, featureless, very public landscape for significant stretches, and privacy was essentially a rumour. Women in particular developed an elaborate system of code words, cooperative shielding by other women holding up blankets or aprons, and strategic use of whatever sparse vegetation was available. Men had a somewhat easier time of it, which was true of most things in 1849, and remains something historians are still working through. Chamber pots were carried in the wagon for use at night. Everything else was the prairie. The code words are worth pausing on, because they reveal something about the particular social ingenuity that trail life required. Women in emigrant diaries refer to needing to gather flowers, to pick berries, to check on something at the edge of camp, elaborate verbal constructions designed to convey biological necessity without saying so directly, in a culture where saying so directly was not done. The cooperative shielding system, women forming a loose circle or holding up blankets or aprons around whoever needed privacy, was organised and efficient, the product of necessity and feminine solidarity under conditions that were, to put it plainly, not what anyone had signed up for when they imagined a fresh start in Oregon. The chamber pot, brought from home and tucked somewhere accessible in the wagon, handled nighttime needs for the women and children with at least a minimum of dignity. What happened to the contents in the morning was less dignified but straightforward. Over the side into the grass, as far from the campsite as the arm could manage. Men and boys, with fewer social constraints and a more direct relationship with the open air, had the comparative luxury of simply walking a short distance from camp, which they did and which the trail journals do not detail, because nobody felt it needed detailing. The real crisis came during illness, and illness was common. Dysentery, which spread through contaminated water and infected food, was one of the trail's most prolific killers, and its primary characteristic, the urgent, relentless, completely non-negotiable need for a bathroom at all hours, was genuinely catastrophic on the open prairie. A wagon train moving 12 miles a day could not stop every time a sick person needed relief. It didn't stop. Sick emigrants managed as best they could from the moving wagon, or called for a halt that the wagon master was not always willing or able to grant, or fell behind the train, and caught up later in a state of depleted dignity that the community around them quietly pretended not to notice, because they were all one bad water source away from the same situation. The trail itself, by the time emigration was at its peak in the late 1840s and early 1850s, was not a pristine wilderness corridor. It was a heavily used road carrying hundreds of wagons a season, and the evidence of that use, the refuse of camps, the carcasses of animals, the disturbed ground around popular stopping points, was visible and olfactory. Popular campsites, used by dozens of wagon trains over multiple seasons, were not pleasant places to linger. Experienced emigrants learned to camp slightly away from the obvious stopping points when possible, on grounds that were both sanitary and aromatic. What this whole situation required ultimately was the same thing the entire trail required: a willingness to set aside the standards you had arrived with and adopt the standards that were actually available, which were lower and more practical, and which you adapted to faster than you would have predicted in Missouri. By the second month, privacy was a nostalgic concept. By the third, you barely remembered what you'd been modest about. The prairie had a way of clarifying priorities, and somewhere around the Kansas border, bathroom logistics fell off the list of things you had energy to be embarrassed about. You did what needed doing, and you kept moving, which was, in the end, the whole philosophy of the Oregon Trail condensed into its most essential form. In dry weather, the Oregon Trail produced dust in quantities that had to be experienced to be believed, and even then, according to emigrant diaries, belief was insufficient. A wagon train of 100 wagons stretched over a mile of trail created a dust cloud that could be seen from 10 miles away, and tasted from considerably closer. Walking at the back of the column was essentially a sustained act of self-punishment. You could not see the wagon in front of you, you could not breathe without a handkerchief pressed to your face, and you could not arrive at camp looking like a recognizable human being. Everything was coated in a fine grey-brown layer. Your skin, your clothes, your teeth, your food, the inside of your lungs. Emigrants who could afford to be particular about the order of travel fought viciously for a spot near the front of the train. Everyone else chewed dust and kept moving. The dust of the Great Plains was not the mild, occasional dust of a dry road back home. It was a specific, high-altitude, extremely fine particulate that got into everything with the thoroughness of something that had been practicing for geological epochs. It got under your fingernails and into your ears and into the corners of your eyes and into the flour barrel you thought you had sealed and into the bedding you had definitely sealed. It coated the inside of the wagon with a layer that could be written in by the end of a dry week. Children who had been washed in the morning were indistinguishable from the surrounding landscape by noon, and nobody had the water or the energy to do anything about it. Breathing was the primary issue, and emigrants addressed it with handkerchiefs, scarves, lengths of cloth tied around the face in configurations that made the whole wagon train look like it was preparing to rob something. These improvised masks were partially effective against the largest particles and entirely useless against the fine dust that travelled through cloth, as if cloth were merely a suggestion. Long-term inhalation of trail dust produced chronic coughs that persisted for weeks, and the general respiratory health of a wagon train in its third month on the dry stretches of the trail was not something a doctor would have found reassuring had there been a doctor. Eyes suffered particularly. The combination of dust and wind produced a sustained irritation that left emigrants with red, streaming, half-closed eyes by the end of a dry day, and trail journals mention eye infections with frequency. There was no remedy worth speaking of. You rinsed when you had clean water, which was not always. You kept a cloth pressed to your face. You tried not to rub them, failed, and rubbed them anyway because the alternative was walking 12 miles with dust in your eyes without rubbing them, and that was asking too much of human willpower. The dust also had temperature implications. Dark clothing, The practical choice for concealing months of unavoidable grime, absorbed the heat of the summer sun and turned its wearer into a slow-moving radiator. Light clothing showed every particle that landed on it, which was all of them. There was no winning combination. You wore what you had and arrived at camp each evening looking like something that had been stored in an attic, which in a sense you had. At the end of a particularly bad dust day, when the wind had been up and the train had been moving since before dawn, and the handkerchief had long since stopped being useful, the simple act of stopping, of the wagon halting and the dust beginning, slowly, to settle, felt like mercy. You stood in the cooling air of evening, and if there was water enough for washing your face, you washed your face, and the water that ran off was the colour of the trail. You looked at the cloth you had wiped your eyes with, and made a decision not to think about it. You ate dinner. You went to sleep with grit in the bedding and grit on your skin and grit probably in the coffee. Morning brought fresh dust. The trail offered no other kind. There was no doctor. There were occasionally people who'd read a medical pamphlet, and there were occasionally people who claimed to have read a medical pamphlet, and these were not always the same people. Getting sick on the Oregon Trail was, to put it plainly, extremely inconvenient in that it could kill you. The great killers were cholera, sudden, violent, and capable of taking a person from apparently healthy to dead in 24 hours, as well as typhoid, dysentery, mountain fever, and accidents. The trail is estimated to have killed one emigrant for every 10 miles of its length, most of them from disease rather than anything dramatic. The treatment options available on the trail in the 1840s and 50s range from inadequate to actively harmful, and included laudanum, calomel, castor oil, camphor, and prayer, roughly in that order. Cholera was the trail's most feared disease, and for good reason. It spread through contaminated water, and the trail's primary water sources, used by hundreds of wagons and thousands of animals, were comprehensively contaminated by the peak emigration years. Cholera struck fast and with no warning whatsoever. A person who was perfectly well at breakfast could be dying by evening, the illness progressing through violent vomiting and diarrhea to dehydration so severe and rapid that the body simply failed. Trail journals record cholera deaths with a particular tonal quality, a kind of flat, stunned shock that the writing itself cannot quite contain. One day there is a person in your party. The next day there is a grave. The grave was dug quickly because cholera's contagion was understood even if its mechanism was not, and because the trail could not stop long. The body was wrapped in whatever cloth could be spared. A service was held, lasting as long as the wagon master judged reasonable, and sometimes less, and the wagon train moved on. Some graves were marked with wooden crosses or carved stones. Others were marked with nothing at all, because there was nothing to mark them with, or because the family was too grief-stricken to manage it, or because it was already time to go. The trail between the Missouri River and Fort Laramie became so densely lined with graves in the heavy emigration years that travelers reported it as a defining feature of the landscape. Dysentery, less immediately lethal than cholera, was more democratically distributed. Almost everyone on the trail experienced it at some point, spreading through the same contaminated water sources and infected food, producing the kind of sustained gastrointestinal misery that is incompatible with walking 12 miles a day, but which you walked anyway, because the wagon train moved regardless of how you felt. The trail journals of emigrant women in particular contain careful, matter-of-fact records of nursing sick family members while simultaneously managing the wagon, the children, the cooking, and their own declining health, written in handwriting that gets shakier across the sick weeks and steadies again as the illness passes. Treatment was well-intentioned and largely useless. Laudanum, a tincture of opium and alcohol, was carried by almost every wagon and administered for pain, for sleeplessness, for anxiety, and for the kinds of severe gastrointestinal illness, where the goal was simply to slow the body down enough to stop losing fluid so fast It worked in the sense that it produced sedation, and it didn't work in the sense that it addressed no underlying cause whatsoever. Calomel, a mercury compound used as a purgative, was given for almost everything and made most things worse. The trail's pharmacopoeia was a monument to the medical knowledge of the 1840s, which was itself a monument to well-meaning ignorance. What actually worked, when it worked, was rest, water, and time, none of which the trail provided in adequate quantities. You rested as much as the wagon train would allow, which was not much. You drank water from whatever source was available, which was frequently the source that had made you sick in the first place. You waited, and either you got better or you didn't, and if you didn't, someone dug a grave on the roadside and the train moved on, and the people who had known you kept going toward Oregon carrying the weight of one more loss in a journey that had already cost more than anyone had accounted for back in Missouri, when it had all seemed so straightforward and the pamphlets had been so encouraging. Somewhere on the trail between Independence, Missouri and the Willamette Valley, women gave birth. Not metaphorically, not after arriving somewhere with a roof and a bed, actually, literally, on the trail, in wagons and camps, occasionally in the middle of a river crossing if the timing was particularly unkind. Emigrant diaries record dozens of births along the Oregon Trail, some proceeding without incident, some resulting in tragedy, and nearly all of them happening with no medical assistance beyond whatever other women in the party could provide, which was occasionally quite a lot. The wagon train typically stopped for one day when a birth occurred, sometimes less, and then moved on, because the schedule waited for no one, including newborns. Mothers who had just given birth were back in the wagon within hours, moving west. The women who assisted at trail births were not nurses or midwives in any formal sense, though some had experience attending births in their home communities, and carried that knowledge with them the way they carried everything else useful, practically and without fanfare. They knew what to do, or they knew enough of what to do, and they did it in the back of a wagon or in a hastily arranged camp space, with hot water heated over the trail fire and clean cloth torn from whatever could be spared, and with the particular focused competence that women on the trail developed for managing situations that were difficult, urgent, and entirely their responsibility to handle. The wagon itself was a challenging delivery room by any measure. It was small, poorly lit, and in motion for most of the day, though the train generally stopped when labour became active, the wagon master having limited options when a woman in his party was actively delivering. The wagon was cleared of as much cargo as possible, which meant that whatever had been organised with such careful effort over the preceding weeks was now piled on the ground outside in the weather, while the interior was given over to the immediate and non-negotiable priority of a new person arriving in the world. Some births on the trail went well. Trail journals record these with a particular warmth. The baby healthy, the mother exhausted but recovering. The wagon train paused for the day, other families bringing food to the new parents, a small celebration at the end of a journey that had provided very few opportunities for celebration. Babies born on the Oregon Trail were sometimes given names that commemorated their geography, boys named Oregon or Columbia, girls named Prairie or Plat, children whose names carried the specific coordinates of where they had entered the world into permanent record. Some births did not go well. Complications that in a settled community might have been manageable became fatal on the trail, where there were no instruments, no surgical options, no way to address serious emergencies beyond what human hands and basic knowledge could accomplish. Mothers died in childbirth on the Oregon Trail, and babies died, and sometimes both died together, and in those cases the grave was dug quickly and the wagon moved on, carrying a grief so large and so raw that the trail journals struggled to hold it. Some entries simply stop for several days and then resume, matter of fact, the silence doing the work that words couldn't. What is most striking in retrospect is not the tragedy but the continuation, Women who'd given birth on the trail, who had delivered a child in a wagon on the open prairie with no doctor and no comfort and no guarantee of either her survival or the baby's, were back in the wagon the following day or the day after, nursing, recovering, managing. They kept going because everyone kept going, and because stopping was not an option, the trail extended to anyone, regardless of what they had just been through. The babies born on the Oregon Trail arrived into the world moving, already in transit, already heading somewhere. Most of them made it. So did their mothers. That they did remains quietly extraordinary. If the Oregon Trail was hard for adults, it was hard for children in ways that adults couldn't fully predict in advance and didn't fully appreciate in hindsight, because survival has a way of making everything else seem minor. Children walked the same miles, breathed the same dust, drank the same questionable water, and ate the same depleting food as everyone else, except they were shorter and had less context for why this was happening to them. Trail diaries from mothers are particularly vivid about the challenge of keeping small children from falling under wagon wheels, wandering into rivers, eating things they found on the ground, or simply disappearing into the tall grass during a rest stop. Children died on the trail in significant numbers, and the families who lost them buried them on the roadside, marked the grave with whatever they could, and moved on because there was nothing else to do. The wagon wheel was the trail's most specific danger to young children, and emigrant mothers knew it with the daily low-level dread that runs through their journals like a current. A child who stumbled near a moving wagon and the trail surface was nothing if not a reliable generator of stumbles could be under a wheel before anyone reacted. Several trail journals record exactly this, in the flat, devastated language of people writing down the worst thing that has ever happened to them, because writing it down is the only available response. Older siblings were frequently assigned the specific job of watching younger ones during travel hours, a responsibility they took seriously and occasionally failed at in the ways that children fail at things, with consequences that the trail did not grade on a curve. The river crossings terrified mothers of young children in a specific and well-founded way. The wagon tipped, the current ran fast, and small children who went into the water often did not come out of it. Not because no one tried, but because the river was faster than anyone trying. Women held their smallest children throughout crossings, sitting in the wagon or standing on the wagon seat, regardless of how precarious that position was, because the alternative of letting a toddler move freely during a river crossing and spring runoff was not an alternative at all. Disease took children efficiently and without ceremony. Cholera and dysentery, which swept through wagon trains with seasonal regularity, killed children faster than adults. The same dehydration working more quickly on smaller bodies with smaller reserves. The infant mortality of the trail was staggering by modern standards, though not entirely out of keeping with the infant mortality of the 1840s generally, which was already high enough to constitute a permanent low-grade tragedy in every community that kept records. Children who had survived measles and whooping cough and scarlet fever in their hometowns encountered cholera on the trail and sometimes did not survive the introduction. And yet children also adapted. The older ones, the 8s and 10s and 12s, were genuinely useful on the trail in ways that surprised their parents and themselves. They gathered fuel, the buffalo chips that powered the plains campfires. They tended to younger siblings. They helped with the animals, ran messages between wagons, fetched water, kept watch. The trail compressed childhood in a specific way. Children who had been farm, kids with chores, became something closer to working members of an enterprise that required everyone's participation. They grew up faster than they would have otherwise, and in ways that the trail required rather than ways they chose. The ones who were very young, the toddlers and infants carried in the wagon and worn on the body, and set down in the grass during rest stops, absorbed the trail differently, without the narrative context that makes experience into memory. They felt the motion, and the heat, and the cold, and the dust, and the particular vibration of a wagon on rough ground, and some of them would carry those sensations without knowing what they were for the rest of their lives. They arrived in Oregon without knowing they had come from anywhere else, which was in its own way a mercy, and grew up in the Willamette Valley, as people for whom Oregon was simply the world, the beginning, and not the destination it had been for everyone around them. Here is the part of the Oregon Trail story that doesn't get enough attention: the fact that it was also, in between the suffering, surprisingly sociable. A wagon train of 50 to 100 wagons contained 50 to 100 families who were all equally desperate, equally tired, and equally in need of something to laugh about. Evenings in camp, when the work was done and the fire was going and nobody was actively dying, could be genuinely pleasant. People played fiddles and guitars, people danced on flat patches of ground, people told stories, shared gossip about the wagon 3 spots up that was clearly not going to make it, and fell into the easy intimacy of people who have been through something hard together. Friendships formed on the Oregon Trail were intense and fast, the product of proximity, shared suffering, and the particular human tendency to bond most tightly with the people you are currently inconvenienced alongside. The evening fire was the social centre of the wagon train, the place where the day's accumulated tension and exhaustion found an outlet. After dinner was cooked and eaten and the dishes were done, all of it performed by firelight on the open ground, people drifted toward each other with the naturalness of people who had no other entertainment available and had discovered somewhere around week 2 that each other was actually quite interesting. Conversations that would have taken months to develop back home happened in days on the trail, because the conditions that strip away small talk, sustained hardship, shared danger, nowhere else to be, are also the conditions that accelerate genuine connection. Music was everywhere. Nearly every wagon train of any size had at least one fiddle player, and usually more, and the sound of a fiddle in the evening camp carried across the flat prairie with a clarity that could be heard from a considerable distance, which was how wagon trains occasionally found each other on the trail following the sound of someone else's music toward company and a shared fire. Dancing happened on whatever flat ground was available, which on the Great Plains was essentially all ground, and trail journals describe impromptu dances with a warmth that suggests they were among the genuinely happy memories of the journey. You danced in trail clothes on prairie grass by firelight with people you had known for 3 weeks, and it was fine. It was better than fine. Courtship also occurred, which made sense given that you had compressed an entire social world into a moving village and removed most of the usual barriers between people. Young men and women who would have taken years to reach the point of conversation in a settled community were talking within days on the trail, walking alongside each other's wagons, sharing the labour of crossings and campsites, demonstrating their respective competencies in circumstances that made competency extremely visible. Trail marriages, couples who met on the trail and married before they reached Oregon, or immediately upon arriving, were common enough to be unremarkable. The conditions that were terrible for comfort were excellent for courtship, which is one of the more ironic features of the whole enterprise. Children created their own social world running parallel to the adults. A trail community of young people who ranged between wagons, developed hierarchies and alliances, shared games and secrets, and formed friendships with the same intensity as their parents. Trail diaries from children who later wrote about the experience as adults described the social life of the wagon train with particular vividness, the particular children they remember, the games they played, the crises they navigated together, the specific quality of the evenings when the adults were talking and the fire was going, and the whole strange enterprise felt, temporarily, like something other than hardship. By the time a wagon train reached Oregon, the people in it knew each other in the specific way that you only know people you've been through something difficult with. Not necessarily well, not necessarily without friction, but deeply in the way that shared experience creates. Some of those friendships lasted lifetimes, carried into the new communities of the Willamette Valley, and maintained through the visiting and neighbouring that was the social fabric of frontier settlement. The trail had been the thing that brought them to the same place at the same time, and the place they ended up was built, in part out of the bonds it had forced them to form. For all the romance of the wagon train as a cooperative venture, it was also a pressure cooker of personalities, grievances, and competing opinions about the correct way to cross a river. Wagon masters held nominal authority, but they were elected, not appointed, which meant they could be unelected at any time by a vote of the company, which happened with some regularity when something went wrong and someone needed blaming. Arguments broke out over campsites, over the order of travel, over whose oxen had gotten into whose supplies, over religious differences, over who had not pulled their weight on the last hill, and over the eternal, irresolvable question of whether to rest an extra day or push on. Some wagon trains split apart mid-trail, one faction heading on and the other holding back, which was almost always a bad idea, and which happened anyway, because humans are resilient in their commitment to being wrong together. The order of travel was a grievance that began early and never entirely resolved. Walking at the front of the train meant clean air, clear visibility, and the psychological comfort of being first. Walking at the back meant dust, reduced visibility, and the existential experience of watching everyone else's problems from a position where you could see them coming but couldn't avoid them. Most wagon trains rotated the order daily, each wagon moving up one position in the column so that no family bore the burden of the rear consistently. This system was fair in theory. In practice, it generated disputes about whether the rotation was being applied correctly, whether certain families had found ways to game it, and whether the wagon that was somehow always near the front through some combination of early rising and strategic positioning was doing so deliberately, which everyone suspected and nobody could prove. Water was a source of conflict at every level. Who watered their animals first at a shared source? Whether a family upstream was contaminating the water for everyone downstream, which they sometimes were and always denied. Whether the wagon master had correctly identified the next water source, or had in fact led the company to the middle of a dry stretch on the word of a guide, who turned out to be significantly more optimistic than accurate. Water disputes had an urgency that most other conflicts lacked, because the consequences of being wrong about water were not merely inconvenient, they were dangerous, and that urgency produced arguments that escalated faster and resolved more slowly than disagreements about, say, whose cow had gotten into whose flour. Religion, which most emigrants had left home carrying with considerable conviction, generated its own category of friction on the trail. The Sabbath was a particular flashpoint. Many emigrants, especially those from devout Protestant communities, believed strongly in resting on Sunday, not merely as a religious obligation but as a practical one, arguing that animals and people needed the rest and that God's law and sound livestock management were in alignment on this point. Others, looking at the calendar and the mountains and doing the arithmetic about the first autumn snows in the Cascades, felt that God would understand the situation and support a Sunday departure. These two positions were genuinely irreconcilable, and wagon trains that couldn't agree simply split on exactly this question. With the Sabbath keepers resting and the pragmatists moving on, each group privately confident they had made the right call. Splitting the train, when it happened, was serious. A smaller company was more vulnerable to everything the trail could produce, had fewer people for river crossings, fewer animals to double team on mountain grades, fewer hands for emergencies. The conventional wisdom, shared by experienced guides and confirmed by the record, was that wagon trains should stay together as long as possible, and that the reasons for splitting were almost never as compelling as they seemed in the moment. This conventional wisdom was widely known and frequently ignored, because the human capacity for concluding that this situation is different from all previous situations is essentially infinite, and yet the train cohered, mostly through all of it. The same pressures that generated conflict also generated the mutual dependence that made conflict ultimately too expensive to sustain. You could be furious at the family 2 wagons ahead, furious about the oxen, the Sabbath, the rotation, the river crossing decision, and still help them when their wagon broke down, because not helping them set a precedent that the next crisis might apply to you. The social contract of the wagon train was maintained not by goodwill, though there was goodwill, but by the mutual recognition that everyone was going to need everyone else before this was over. Which was, when you thought about it, not a bad foundation for a community, temporary or otherwise. The Oregon Trail ran through the homelands of dozens of native nations, the Pawnee, the Sioux, the Shoshone, the Cayuse, the Nez Perce, and many others, and the history of those encounters is significantly more complicated than either the hostile ambush narrative or the helpful guide narrative that popular culture has tended to offer. Most interactions between emigrants and native people along the trail were commercial. Native. Communities sold horses, food, and knowledge of the terrain, ferried wagons across rivers, and guided parties through difficult mountain passes in exchange for trade goods. The massive disruption to the trail corridor, the destruction of grass, the depletion of game, the introduction of disease, was noticed and resented by native communities almost immediately, and relations deteriorated steadily through the 1850s as the emigrant traffic increased. In the early years of the trail, through the early 1840s, encounters were largely peaceful and often mutually beneficial, at least in the immediate term. Native communities along the trail had been trading with European and American trappers and travellers for decades by the time emigrant wagon trains began moving through, and they understood the trade economy and participated in it with sophistication. Sioux traders near Fort Laramie sold the emigrants fresh horses to replace depleted animals. Shoshone guides led parties through the complex terrain of the Snake River country for negotiated fees. Cayuse communities at the Whitman Mission in present-day Washington provided a stopping point and a degree of assistance to exhausted emigrants in the final stretch before Oregon. What the emigrant trail represented for native nations along its corridor was something the emigrants themselves rarely paused to consider: the systematic occupation of their homeland by a movement so large and so continuous that it could not be negotiated with or redirected. A single wagon train passing through native territory was a disruption. Hundreds of wagon trains passing through every season, year after year, was a transformation of the grass that the buffalo depended on, of the game populations that native communities depended on, of the rivers that were being fouled by the refuse of thousands of travellers and tens of thousands of animals. The buffalo herds that emigrant journals describe with amazement in the early 1840s, so vast they darkened the horizon, were visibly diminishing by the early 1850s, and the communities whose survival depended on them knew exactly what was causing it. Tensions increased visibly as the decade progressed. The Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851 attempted to establish boundaries and compensation for the disruption the trail was causing, and it was almost immediately inadequate, both because the United States government failed to honour its terms and because the scale of emigration made the disruptions it was meant to address worse with each passing season. Incidents that emigrant journals characterised as attacks, wagons harassed, livestock taken, were, from the perspective of the native communities involved, responses to an invasion that had been ongoing for years and that no treaty had meaningfully addressed. The full consequences of the Oregon Trail for the native nations of the Intermountain West unfolded over decades after the emigration itself, in broken treaties, in military campaigns, in the reservation system that confined peoples who had lived across an entire continent to small fractions of their former territories. The emigrants who walked the trail were not, as individuals, responsible for this in any simple sense. Most of them were farmers and families who had come from difficult circumstances and were trying to build something better, and who thought, if they thought about it at all, that the land they were going to was empty and available. It was not empty. It was not available. And the cost of that misapprehension was paid almost entirely by the people who had been there first. The Oregon Trail had no mile markers, no signage, and no reliable way to know exactly how far you had come or how far you had to go, except for the great physical landmarks that emigrants began to anticipate with an almost religious intensity. Chimney Rock, a spire of sandstone rising 300 feet above the Nebraska plain, became the most famous landmark on the entire trail, proof that you had left the Great Plains behind and were entering something new. Scotts Bluff, Independence Rock, South Pass, the Snake River Canyon, each one was noted in diaries with a kind of trembling, exhausted relief that you only feel when you have been looking for something for a very long time and have finally found it. Independence Rock, a massive granite dome in present-day Wyoming, was the crucial milestone. Emigrants who reached it by the 4th of July were on schedule. Those who reached it later began doing the math about winter in the mountains, and the math was not comforting. Chimney Rock appears in more emigrant journals than any other single landmark on the trail, which gives some sense of what it meant psychologically to people who had been crossing what looked like the same flat landscape for weeks. You could see it from 20 miles away on a clear day, a narrow finger of rock rising improbably from the valley of the North Plat, so distinct and so tall that it looked less like a geological formation and more like something left behind by a civilization that had better architectural ambitions than equipment. It appeared on the horizon days before you reached it, growing slowly larger in a way that gave you something concrete to walk toward, which on the featureless stretches of the Nebraska plain was a gift whose value is difficult to overstate. Emigrants carved their names into Independence Rock by the thousands, which is how it earned its other nickname, the Register of the Desert. The rock, a broad granite dome rising out of the high Wyoming plain, was already covered in names and dates when the emigrant period began, inscribed by mountain men and earlier travellers, and the emigrants added their own in paint, axle grease, and carved script, each one a small declaration. We were here, we made it this far, this is our name, remember it. The July 4th target was serious. A wagon train arriving at Independence Rock on schedule had a reasonable chance of crossing the Cascades before the first snows. Arriving in late July or early August was not a crisis yet. Arriving in August and looking at the remaining distance was the beginning of a different kind of mathematics. Fort Laramie, roughly 600 miles from Missouri, was the first true outpost of something resembling civilization on the trail, and it was greeted with an emotional intensity disproportionate to what it actually offered. It was a trading post and, from 1849, a military installation. Rough buildings, a blacksmith, a supply store with prices calibrated to the fact that you had no alternatives, and the particular social relief of seeing structures that had walls and roofs and were not moving. Emigrants stopped at Fort Laramie to repair wagons, resupply where they could afford to, and exchange information about trail conditions ahead with people who had recently travelled them. They also shed weight. Fort Laramie was where many of the heaviest abandoned possessions ended up. The iron stoves and rocking chairs left in the shadow of the fort's walls for whoever might want them. The landmarks work their psychological magic not because they indicated ease ahead, they didn't, and emigrants knew it, but because they marked progress in a journey where progress was otherwise hard to feel. You had been walking for weeks. The sky looked the same, the grass looked the same, the dust was the same dust. And then on the horizon, Chimney Rock appeared, and you had evidence. You were somewhere different than where you had been. The trail had moved under you even when it hadn't felt like it. You were not walking in place. You were going somewhere, and the somewhere had landmarks, and each one meant that the next one was closer than the last. it was enough. On the Oregon Trail, enough was what you had, and you learned to treat it like plenty. For hundreds of miles, the Oregon Trail followed the Platte River across what is now Nebraska, and the Platte River Road became one of the most famous stretches of the entire journey, not because it was difficult, but because it was so thoroughly, relentlessly, almost philosophically flat. The Platte Valley offered no shade, no cover, no dramatic scenery to distract from the fact that you were walking through what appeared to be the same square mile of land on repeat. The river itself was famously described as too thick to drink and too thin to plough. Shallow, wide, braided with sandbars, and not particularly useful for anything except existing. Emigrants who had left Missouri in the grip of optimism often began their first serious doubts somewhere along the Platte, when they realized that the Great Plains were not a prelude to the journey, but a substantial portion of it. The flatness of the Platte Valley was, in its own way, a gift, a smooth, navigable road that covered ground efficiently and spared the oxen, the mountain grade straining that was coming for everyone later. Experienced guides recommended the Platte route precisely because of its evenness, its reliable water supply, and the relative predictability of its terrain. These were real advantages, and emigrants who understood them appreciated the Platte for what it was, a long, uneventful stretch of easy miles that was building their reserves for the hard miles ahead. This appreciation coexisted with the fact that the Platte was also extraordinarily oppressively boring, in a way that the hard miles ahead were not. The landscape along the Platte in the emigration season was not entirely without interest. The buffalo were here in the early years, vast herds that crossed the river in waves, occasionally so enormous that wagon trains had to halt and wait for them to pass, which sounds thrilling until the wait stretched to several hours and the schedule anxiety began accumulating. Prairie dogs built their towns alongside the trail and provided entertainment for children and occasional sprained ankles for anyone who stepped in a burrow unaware. Wildflowers grew in the grass, which emigrant women pressed into their journals, small botanical records of the journey tucked between the pages of hardship. The sky above the Platte was genuinely extraordinary, high, clear, and enormous in the way that only Great Plains sky is enormous, a dome of weather and light that made everything below it feel very small and very exposed. The exposure was constant. The Platte Valley provided no shelter from wind, which moved across the plains without obstruction and made the already challenging task of fire building significantly more difficult. It provided no shelter from sun, which in July pressed down on the walking emigrants with an intensity that made the shade of the wagon, minimal, partial, feel like genuine relief. It provided no shelter from the electrical storms that built in the afternoons with theatrical suddenness. The sky, going dark and green, and then delivering lightning so close and so loud that the oxen spooked, and the children cried, and the adults crouched in the wagon and tried to look confident about a situation that was not confidence-inspiring. The sound of the Platte River Road was the sound of the trail at its most sustained and elemental. The creak of wagon wheels, the heavy breathing of oxen, the rhythm of footsteps on hard ground, the wind and the river, always the river, shallow and wide and constantly present, muttering to itself over its sandbars with the self-absorbed persistence of something that had been doing this for a very long time and intended to keep doing it, regardless of whether 100 wagons full of hopeful Midwesterners were watching. You walked alongside it for weeks. You drank from it, despite everything. You cursed it, and you appreciated it, and you followed it because it was the road, and eventually, after more days than you had quite expected, the flat green corridor of the Platte gave way to something new, and you looked up from your walking and saw on the horizon the first suggestion of hills, and felt your heart lift in a way that only makes sense to someone who has been on the Plat River Road for 3 weeks and has been waiting for this moment for most of them. Everything that had come before the Rocky Mountains was, in its own way, preparation. The Rockies were where the trail became something else. The great crossing at South Pass, the wide, relatively gentle saddle through the mountains that made the Oregon Trail possible at all, was not as dramatic as emigrants expected, and many were surprised to find themselves standing at the Continental Divide on what looked like an ordinary high prairie. But the approaches and descents on either side were another matter. The Blue Mountains in Oregon, the last major mountain barrier before the Willamette Valley, were often where wagon trains fell apart. Axles broke on the descents, oxen gave out on the climbs, and the realization that you had already come so far and still had so far to go produced a kind of exhausted despair that trail journals capture with painful clarity. South Pass was the hinge on which the entire Oregon Trail turned, geographically and psychologically. It was the point that made the crossing possible, a broad, high-altitude gap in the Rocky Mountains wide enough and gradual enough that a loaded wagon could cross the Continental Divide without the kind of vertical drama that the word mountains implied. Emigrants who'd been dreading the Rockies for months arrived at South Pass and found something that looked, disappointingly, like a very large meadow at elevation. The divide was marked by a sign in later years and by nothing at all in the earlier ones, and some wagon trains crossed it without fully realizing they had done so until someone pointed out that the water was now flowing west instead of east. The psychological significance of South Pass outweighed its physical drama considerably. Standing on the Continental Divide meant that you had crossed the backbone of the continent, that everything from this point forward was draining toward the Pacific, toward Oregon, toward the place you were going. The water in the streams was going the same direction you were. This was not a minor thing, emotionally, after 2 months of trail. Emigrant journals record the crossing of South Pass with a particular quality of feeling. Not elation exactly, because elation required energy that most people didn't have by this point, but something quieter and more durable, the recognition that the thing you'd been trying to do was actually going to happen. You were going to make it. Probably. The descent from South Pass into the Green River country was the first real taste of what the mountains could do to a loaded wagon on a downgrade. Gravity, which had been a neutral force on the flat plains, became an active problem on the mountain. Descents. A fully loaded wagon rolling downhill built momentum faster than the oxen could manage, and the standard solution, chaining the rear wheels so they skidded rather than rolled, essentially turning them into brakes, was partially effective and entirely hard on the wheels. The screech of iron on rock on a steep mountain descent was one of the trail's more alarming sounds, and the experience of managing a wagon on a significant downgrade, while the oxen scrambled for footing below, and the whole rig threatened to overtake them, was one that trail journals describe with vivid, retrospective anxiety. The Blue Mountains of eastern Oregon were the final insult of a journey that had been delivering insults for months. They came after the high desert of present-day Idaho, which had already depleted the animals and the people, and they arrived at a point in the journey when reserves of everything, food, energy, patience, wagon parts, were at their lowest. The ascents were steep enough to require double-teaming even exhausted oxen. The descents were technical enough to require roping the wagons down in some places, every available person on the rope, the wagon inching down the grade with a controlled reluctance that took hours per descent. Wagons that had crossed the Great Plains and the Rockies intact broke on the Blue Mountains, and the trail through them was marked with the debris of vehicles that had finally given out at the worst possible moment. And then, on the far side of the Blues, the land opened. The valley of the Columbia River spread below, green and wide, and beyond it, Oregon. You could see it. After 2,000 miles and 5 months, you could actually see it. A covered wagon was a piece of technology doing something it was not entirely designed to do across terrain it was not designed for, powered by animals who had their own opinions about the whole enterprise. Breakdowns were not a possibility, they were a certainty. Wagon wheels cracked on rocky ground. Axles snapped under overloaded beds. Wheel rims worked loose after hundreds of miles of expansion and contraction in changing temperatures. Iron bolts sheared off. Tongues, the long wooden beam connecting the wagon to the oxen, broke at the worst possible moments, usually on a hill. Every wagon carried spare parts, extra wheels if the family could afford them, spare axle timber, iron for the forge if there was a blacksmith in the party. Emigrant men who'd been farmers and merchants learned to do rough wagon repair whether they had any talent for it or not, because the alternative was staying where you were, and where you were was frequently nowhere. The wheel was the wagon's most vulnerable component and the one that failed with the most variety and creativity. Wooden spokes dried and cracked in the heat of the desert stretches, then swelled back in the rain so tightly that the wheel bound against the hub. Iron tires, the metal rims that held the wooden wheel together, expanded in heat and contracted at night, and after enough cycles of this they worked loose from the wood entirely, clanking and shifting until they finally parted company with the wheel at some inopportune moment. The standard field repair for a loose tire required removing it completely, soaking the wooden wheel in water to expand it, reseating the tire, and hoping the fix held until the next trading post. On the dry stretches of the trail, finding enough water to soak a wagon wheel was its own small problem nested inside the larger one. Axle failures were the trail's most serious mechanical crisis, because an axle was not something you improvised. The rear axle of a loaded prairie schooner bore the full weight of the wagon's cargo and experienced the full shock of every rock and rut in the road, which on 2,000 miles of unimproved terrain was considerable. Wagons that had been overloaded in Missouri, which was most of them, before the abandonment of furniture and iron stoves, somewhere in Wyoming had been stressing their axles from the first day, and the axles kept a running account. When they finally broke, usually on a grade or at a crossing where the stress was highest, the wagon settled to the ground with a finality that meant either you had a spare or you needed to find one. Spare axle timber was among the most valuable commodities at the trail's trading posts, priced accordingly. Blacksmithing was among the most sought-after skills in any wagon party, and wagon trains that included someone with iron-working experience were measurably better off than those that didn't. A competent blacksmith could repair iron wheel rims, fabricate replacement bolts and brackets, straighten bent metal components, and improvise solutions to mechanical problems that had no standard answer. Trail journals from parties with a blacksmith describe breakdowns as setbacks. Trail journals from parties without one describe the same breakdowns with a different quality of feeling. The repair culture of the wagon train was one of its more impressive features. Men who had been storekeepers and lawyers and school teachers in Ohio developed competency with wagon mechanics from necessity, guided by whoever in the party had the most relevant experience, and the trial and error method that was the trail's primary educational philosophy. Women who had watched their husbands fail to repair something correctly, the first time occasionally intervened with practical suggestions that the journals record with careful diplomatic phrasing. Children handed tools, everyone watched. Knowledge transferred informally, constantly, and under conditions of pressure that made it stick. By the time a wagon that had broken down twice was repaired by amateurs with improvised tools in the middle of a mountain pass, it had become something different from the vehicle purchased in Missouri. It was an accumulation of repairs and compromises and creative solutions, held together by iron and rope, and the specific stubbornness of people who had come too far to stop. It looked worse than it had at departure. It functioned well enough to keep going. On the Oregon Trail, well enough was an achievement, and people who achieved it did not complain about the aesthetics. The oxen carried the whole enterprise on their massive patient backs, and the trail repaid their loyalty with an escalating series of hardships. The early weeks on the trail, while the animals were still strong and the grass was abundant, were the easy part. As the summer wore on and the grass became sparse and overgrazed by the hundreds of wagon trains ahead of yours, the oxen began to lose condition. By the time a train reached the high desert of present-day Idaho, the animals that had pulled 2,000 pounds across the continent were gaunt, footsore, and showing the particular stubborn exhaustion that oxen express by simply stopping. Teams were doubled on the mountain ascents, 2 teams hitched together to pull a single wagon up, and even then the strain was enormous. Oxen that died on the trail were butchered if possible and left if not, and their bones became landmarks in their own right. The grass problem developed gradually and then urgently. In the early stretches of the trail through Missouri and Kansas, spring grass was abundant, and the animals grazed well during the nighttime hours, recovering their energy for the following day's pull. But the Oregon Trail was not a single road. It was a corridor of parallel ruts worn by hundreds of thousands of animals over decades, and that corridor was grazed to the soil along the most travelled sections. Wagon trains that started late in the season, after the peak May and June departures, found the trailside grass already depleted by everyone who had gone before them, and their animals began losing weight almost immediately. The grass of the high desert in present-day Idaho and Oregon, what there was of it, was sparse, dry, and nutritionally inadequate compared to the rich prairie grass of the eastern sections. Water access compounded the grass problem in the western stretches. An ox working hard in summer heat requires an enormous quantity of water, many gallons a day, and the distances between reliable water sources on the Snake River Plain were measured not in hours but in days. Emigrants planning these stretches had to carry water for their animals as well as themselves, which meant additional weight on already depleted teams pulling through the hottest and driest terrain of the entire journey. Trail journals from the Snake River country in August read like a series of increasingly desperate calculations. How far to the next water? How much the animals can manage? What happens if we're wrong? Foot problems were universal by the western half of the journey. Oxen's hooves, designed for soft pasture ground, were damaged by the sharp volcanic rock of the Idaho desert and the rough gravel of the mountain approaches. Emigrants who had the materials made improvised leather booties for their animals, which helped somewhat and which the oxen found objectionable, requiring the additional labour of convincing a footsore and tired ox that the leather thing on its hoof was helping rather than threatening. Experienced drovers knew how to read the subtle signs of declining hoof condition. Inexperienced ones learned by watching their animals slow down and then stop. An ox that died on the trail was first a tragedy and then, very quickly, a resource. Beef that had been depleting steadily in the supply barrels could be partially replenished from the carcass of an animal that could no longer pull, and trail journals record the slaughter and butchering of failed oxen with a matter-of-fact practicality that reflects both the genuine need and the emotional complexity of killing an animal you had named and worked alongside for 5 months. The meat was dried or salted as quickly as possible in the summer heat. The hide was kept for leather. What couldn't be used was left on the trail, and the bones joined the accumulating record of the journey, the silent inventory of everything and everyone the trail had used up and left behind on its way to Oregon. The nights on the Oregon Trail were something emigrants rarely prepared for in sufficient detail, which is understandable given that they were primarily thinking about the days. Sleeping arrangements varied by family, by weather, and by the amount of space that hadn't already been colonized by supplies. Some families slept inside the wagon, curled around the cargo in a configuration that required a certain athletic flexibility and a high tolerance for being in contact with someone else's knees at all times. Others pitched canvas tents alongside the wagon, which offered more space but less protection from rain, wind, and the particular unease of sleeping on the open prairie, with a fire dying beside you and a very large country all around you in every direction. Children were typically packed into whatever gap remained, and the question of who got which sleeping arrangement was, according to multiple diaries, a source of nightly negotiation. The wagon bed at night was, by any objective measure, not a comfortable place to sleep. The floor was the wagon bed, which was wood, which was hard, which was also the surface on which 500 pounds of food and supplies had been arranged with their own structural logic that did not account for the human body. Blankets layered on top of flour barrels and tool chests created a surface that was uneven in specific and consistent ways. A ridge here, a corner there, a particular protrusion that you mapped in the first week and arranged yourself around for the remainder of the journey. You learned to sleep in the shape the wagon gave you, which was not the shape you would have chosen, but which became, with enough repetition, simply the shape of sleep. The canvas cover offered real protection from rain when it was properly tensioned and treated, and degraded protection as the season wore on, and the canvas dried and loosened and developed small failures along the seams that admitted thin lines of water directly onto the bedding below. Every emigrant family had a canvas maintenance routine that involved periodic retentioning and waterproofing, and the families that neglected it discovered the consequences during the first serious rainstorm, at 2 a.m, when the bedding began to absorb moisture with a patient thoroughness of cloth that has been waiting for exactly this opportunity. Tent sleeping offered more horizontal space and the psychological comfort of being able to lie flat, which the wagon frequently didn't permit for adults of average height. Canvas tents pitched on the prairie were pegged into whatever ground the trail provided, which in rocky or hardpan sections meant pegs that didn't seat properly and tents that shifted in the night wind, with an irregular, low-level drama that interrupted sleep at intervals. Rain turned the tent floor to mud. Wind that was manageable during the day became at 2 a.m. a sustained argument with the tent structure that required getting up and reseating pegs in the dark in whatever you had been sleeping in, which was not your best outfit. The sounds of the night camp were their own category of experience. The animals moved and breathed in the darkness beyond the wagon circle, the particular heavy exhale of an ox settling, the nervous shifting of horses, the occasional distant howl that travelled across the prairie with unsettling clarity. The fires burned down, and the temperature dropped, and the sounds of the camp changed as people fell asleep. The conversations quieting, the children settling, the night watch taking up their positions at the edges of the circle, the creak of the wagons as they cooled and contracted in the night air, and then, before it felt like enough time had passed, it was 4 a.m. again. The camp stirred back to life with the particular reluctant energy of people who had not slept enough and knew it, and were going to keep going anyway, because the trail did not adjust its schedule to the quality of anyone's rest. You folded the bedding, you packed the wagon, you started the fire, and you did the whole thing again. One more day closer to Oregon, one more night's sleep added to the long accumulating account of nights that were not quite enough but were what you had. Every wagon train needed someone to be in charge, and the wagon master was the person who had either volunteered or been persuaded to occupy that position, a decision they almost certainly reconsidered within the first 2 weeks. The wagon master's responsibilities were comprehensive. He set the daily departure time, navigated the route, managed water and grazing stops, mediated disputes between families, made the call on river crossings, and served as the first point of contact for everything that went wrong, which was a great deal of things and quite frequently. He was elected, not appointed, which meant his authority lasted exactly as long as the majority of the train was willing to extend it. Trail journals document wagon masters being voted out of position mid-journey, overruled on major decisions, and occasionally abandoned entirely by factions of the train, who had their own ideas about the best route to Oregon. The qualifications for wagon master were loosely defined and inconsistently held. Ideally, you wanted someone who had travelled the trail before, a mountain man, a former trapper, a scout with actual experience of the terrain between Missouri and the Willamette Valley. These people existed and were hired when available, at rates that reflected both their value and their awareness of how much you needed them. When experienced guides were unavailable, wagon trains elected whoever in the party seemed most competent, most confident, or most willing to accept responsibility, which were three different qualities that only occasionally resided in the same person. Navigation was the wagon master's most technically demanding responsibility. The trail was not a single defined road, but a braided network of ruts and tracks that divided and reconverged around obstacles, water sources, and the accumulated preferences of everyone who had travelled it before. A wagon master who didn't know the route relied on guidebooks. There were several of varying accuracy, and on information gathered from travellers coming the other direction, who were going back east for various reasons and whose reports on trail conditions ahead were invaluable and not always reliable. The question of which fork to take at a major junction, in the absence of signage and with limited information and 50 families waiting for your decision, was one that required either genuine knowledge or the ability to project confidence while essentially guessing. The social management responsibilities were, in many ways, harder than the navigation. Mediating between families who'd been walking together for 2 months and had developed specific, detailed grievances about each other required a particular combination of authority, tact, and the willingness to occasionally tell people things they didn't want to hear. Wagon masters who were too authoritarian generated resentment and rebellion. Wagon masters who were too accommodating generated chaos. The effective ones threaded this needle daily, making decisions that were not universally popular and explaining the reasoning in ways that kept the majority on board even when the minority was loudly unhappy. The moment of a wagon master's unmaking was usually a river crossing or a route decision that went badly. A wagon tipped, animals were lost. A family found themselves on the wrong side of a flooded river with no obvious way across, and the vote of confidence that had elected the wagon master evaporated with the speed of trust under pressure. The election of a replacement happened quickly, usually at the next evening's camp, with the efficiency of a community that needed the position filled more than it needed to process the drama of the transition. The former wagon master either accepted a reduced role or departed the train entirely, and the new one began navigating the same impossible combination of responsibilities that had undone his predecessor. Most wagon masters, to their credit, got their trains to Oregon. Not all of them, not all of the trains, but most, through a combination of genuine competence, good luck, and the stubborn forward momentum of people who had come too far to stop, managed to lead their companies across 2,000 miles of difficult country and deliver them, depleted and relieved, to the far side. They rarely received much recognition for it. The train arrived, the families dispersed to their land claims, and the wagon master went back to being whoever he had been before the trail, carrying the knowledge of what he had managed in the space between Missouri and Oregon, which was considerable. Between the Rockies and the Pacific, the Oregon Trail passed through some of the most arid terrain in North America, and the problem of water, where to find it, how to carry enough of it, and what to do when the barrel ran dry, became the defining anxiety of the trail's western half. Emigrants who had grown up near reliable rivers and springs found the high desert of present-day Idaho and Oregon profoundly disorienting. The distances between water sources were measured in days, not hours, and the animals needed water long before the humans became genuinely desperate. Trail guides noted the locations of springs and streams with careful precision, and emigrant diaries from the western stretches read like a sustained meditation on thirst, the value of water, and the specific quality of light that appears on the horizon when you're not sure. if what you're seeing is a stream or wishful thinking. The Snake River Plain of present-day southern Idaho was the trail's longest and most demanding desert stretch. A vast, elevated plateau of volcanic rock and sparse sage that extended for hundreds of miles with a consistency that was almost impressive. The Snake River itself ran through the plain but was frequently inaccessible. Its canyon cut deep below the surrounding plateau in many sections, the water audible and visible from the rim but unreachable without descending cliffs that no wagon could manage. Emigrants could hear the river, see the river, and die of thirst while the river ran 40 feet below them, which was one of the more specific cruelties the trail had to offer. Water rationing began before the desert and intensified within it. The water barrels carried on the exterior of the wagon, a feature of every sensibly equipped prairie schooner, held finite quantities that experienced travellers knew how to manage and inexperienced ones sometimes didn't. Children were given water first. The animals were watered from the barrels when the distance to the next source was uncertain, pouring the contents of a barrel into a canvas bucket held up to the ox's nose, watching the level drop and calculating whether what remained would be enough. When the calculation came out wrong, the consequences were serious. Dehydrated oxen couldn't pull. An oxen that stopped pulling in the middle of the Snake River Plain presented a logistical problem with no good solutions. The desert heat concentrated every other problem the trail produced. Dust was worse in the dry heat, rising higher and settling more slowly. The rocky ground was harder on the animals' feet. The human body required more water than it did on the cool, moist stretches of the plains, and the water available was frequently of worse quality, alkaline springs and stagnant pools that made animals and people sick but which were consumed anyway because the alternative was worse. Emigrants learned to identify alkali water by the white crust around its edges and the slightly soapy quality of its surface, and they learned to avoid it when they could and accept it when they couldn't. The relief of finding good water after a hard desert day was physical and emotional in equal measure. Trail journals from the western stretches document the discovery of springs and streams with the same trembling gratitude that marks the accounts of river crossings survived and mountains passed. You knelt at the water and drank, and the animals drank, and the barrels were refilled, and everything that had been tightening over the past waterless miles, the anxiety, the calculation, the low-grade dread of the arithmetic coming out wrong, released all at once. You made camp by the water. You rested. In the morning you filled everything that would hold water, noted the next known source on the trail guide, calculated the distance and started the desert arithmetic again. But for that evening, by the water, in the cooling air of the high desert, it was enough to have found it. It was always enough to have found it. Emigrants wrote letters home from the trail with a dedication that was touching, practically useless, and deeply human. Mail could be sent from specific points on the trail, Fort Laramie, Fort Hall, the major trading posts, and would eventually make its way back east by whatever combination of riders, wagons and mail routes were available, arriving weeks or months after it was written. People wrote knowing this. They wrote anyway. Trail letters are a specific literary genre, distinguished by their mixture of determined optimism, coded anxiety, specific requests for things that couldn't be sent anyway, and the particular warmth of people who had not spoken to anyone they loved in a long time. Some letters were written in stages over several days, a line added each evening before camp was too dark to see the paper. The earlier entries, already past and irrelevant by the time the later ones were written. The act of writing itself served a purpose beyond communication. On the Oregon Trail, where every day was composed of physical demands and practical decisions, the letter home was one of the few spaces where you were allowed to think about where you had come from and what you had left. Writing to your mother or your brother or your neighbour back in Ohio required you to narrate your experience, to find language for things that were still too large and too close to be fully processed. to translate the dust and the rivers and the graves and the evenings by the fire into sentences that could cross the distance and arrive in a parlour you could still picture in detail. The optimism in trail letters is sometimes startling, given what the journals written at the same time reveal about conditions. People who were exhausted and sick and frightened in their private journals wrote to their families that things were going well, that the country was beautiful, that the animals were holding up. This was not necessarily dishonesty, it was consideration, and it was the particular protective instinct of someone who knew that the people receiving the letter couldn't do anything about the truth and would only be made miserable by it. You told them the parts that were fine. You told them you were well. You told them Oregon was going to be worth it, which you half believed, which was enough to write it. The practical requests embedded in trail letters were poignant in their impossibility. Could someone send the recipe for the apple cake? Could someone check on the house? Could someone tell the neighbours where they had gone, if they hadn't already heard? These requests assumed a return correspondence that would take months, and a continuity of life back east that had already been interrupted by departure, and which the writer knew on some level would never be fully restored. The letters were sent into the distance, toward a life that had already been left, and the people who wrote them knew this, and wrote anyway, because the alternative to writing was not writing, and not writing was a kind of loss that the trail had already produced enough of. At Fort Laramie, the hub of trail correspondence on the eastern half of the journey, the mail situation was chaotic and improvised. Letters were handed to travellers heading east, to military couriers, to anyone who was going the direction you needed the letter to go. Some letters arrived, some didn't. A letter written at Fort Laramie in June might arrive in Ohio in September, by which time its author was in Oregon, and the news it contained was 3 months old, and the emotional landscape it described had already shifted beyond recognition. The person who had written it was no longer quite the same person who arrived. The trail had seen to that. But the letter remained, a fixed point of the journey, a record of who you were at 600 miles and what you were thinking about, and for the person who received it, reading it months later, it was a kind of contact that the distance had made almost sacred. And then, after everything, after the dust and the mud and the rivers and the mountains and the broken axles and the graves dug in the road and the months of hardtack and the mornings that started before sunrise and the evenings too tired to sleep, after all of it, you arrived. The Willamette Valley of Oregon, in particular, was genuinely beautiful, green, temperate, rich with soil, threaded with rivers that actually had fish in them. Emigrants who had endured the crossing sometimes described their first sight of the valley with a kind of stunned, wordless relief that their diaries struggled to capture. Some of them cried, some of them sat down and couldn't get up for a while. Some of them looked at the land they had come all this way to claim and felt, for the first time in months, that it had been worth it. Some of them, it must be, said, were not sure. The descent from the Blue Mountains into the Columbia River basin was the visual announcement of arrival, the landscape changing from the dry rocky terrain of the eastern Oregon high desert to the green, wide river valleys of the west side of the Cascades. The Columbia River itself, wide and powerful and navigable, was a different kind of water than anything the trail had produced. Not the shallow, problematic, contaminated water of the plains, but a deep, cold, purposeful river running west to the Pacific. Emigrants who reached the Columbia had the option of continuing by raft or boat for the final stretch to the Willamette, floating the last miles of a journey that had been walked almost entirely on foot. After 2,000 miles, sitting still on the water and watching the land move past had a quality that journals reach for words to describe and don't entirely find. The Willamette Valley in the mid-19th century was everything the pamphlets had claimed, and several things they had not mentioned. The soil was genuinely extraordinary, deep, dark and rich, in the way that only river valley soil that has been depositing for millennia can be, capable of producing the kind of crops that farmers from exhausted Midwestern land found almost implausible. The climate was mild in the way that maritime climates are mild, cool and wet in winter, warm and dry in summer, without the extremes of heat and cold that had characterized life in Missouri or Ohio. The forests were enormous, the timber resources visibly vast, and the rivers full of salmon in a way that people who'd been eating salt pork for 5 months found genuinely affecting. What the pamphlets had not mentioned was how much work stood between arrival and any version of the life that had been advertised. The valley was full of trees that needed clearing before crops could be planted. The land needed fencing. The house needed building, from materials you had to fell and process yourself, with tools that had already been used hard for 5 months. The neighbours, if there were any, were other emigrants in the same situation, which provided community but not assistance beyond what mutual aid could supply. The infrastructure of settlement, roads, mills, stores, churches, was either non-existent or in its earlier stages. You had arrived at the destination. The destination was a field. Some emigrants stood at the edge of the Willamette Valley and felt the full weight of that gap between the promise and the reality, and their journals record it with a complicated mixture of gratitude and exhaustion that is one of the most honest emotional registers in the whole literature of the trail. You had done it. You had walked 2,000 miles and arrived in the place you had come to, and now you had to build everything from the beginning, in a place where the beginning was quite literal. With whatever you had left after the journey had taken what it took, you were here. That was true. What here was going to become was still entirely up to you. Arriving in Oregon was not the end of the difficulty. It was the end of the specific difficulty of the trail, and the beginning of a new and different set of difficulties, most of them involving the question of shelter before November. Land claims were staked under the Donation Land Claim Act of 1850, which allowed married couples to claim 640 acres of Oregon Territory land, a genuinely extraordinary amount of land, and also a genuinely extraordinary amount of work to develop before the first frost. The first structures most emigrant families built were not houses, but rough lean-tos or log cabins, barely large enough to keep the rain off. 4 walls, a dirt floor, a stone fireplace if you had time, a fire pit if you didn't. The first winter in Oregon was spent in conditions not entirely unlike the wagon, except stationary, which emigrants reported as an improvement, though not an unqualified one. The race to shelter began the moment the wagon stopped. October in the Willamette Valley came with rain, not the dramatic episodic rain of the plains, but the sustained, grey patient Pacific Northwest rain that began in October and did not finish until April, falling softly and continuously on everything you owned and everyone you were responsible for, with the calm persistence of something that has all the time in the world. Emigrants who arrived in September had a narrow window of dry fall weather to build before the rains established themselves. Emigrants who arrived in October were building in the rain, which was slower and more miserable, but which was also simply what needed doing. Felling trees for a cabin required axes, time, and technique, and the timber of the Willamette Valley demanded all 3 in quantities that surprised people who had only ever worked with the modest woodlands of the Midwest. The Douglas firs and Oregon oaks of the valley were enormous trees that had been growing since before European contact, whose trunks required hours of work with axes that had already been used for 5 months and were not at their best. Neighbours helped neighbours with the felling, because the social economy of the frontier ran on reciprocal labour in ways that made the wagon train social dynamics look simple. You helped someone build and they helped you build, and the community took shape one cabin at a time. The first cabin was not comfortable, and emigrants who were honest in their journals said so directly. 4 log walls with chinking of mud and moss that kept out the rain imperfectly. A dirt floor that became mud in wet weather, which was most weather. A fireplace that drew well when it drew and filled the cabin with smoke when it didn't. A roof of split cedar shakes that was waterproof until the first hard rain revealed its deficiencies, which it did reliably and without delay. Windows were covered with oiled cloth if you had the cloth, or left open, and shuttered at night, admitting a cold that reminded you persistently that you were living in a box in a field, in a place that was building itself around you one season at a time. The first winter tested the people who had survived the trail in different ways than the trail had. The trail's hardships were active. You walked, you managed, you made decisions under pressure. The first winter's hardships were patient. You waited, you maintained, you managed resources against a timeline that extended to spring with the indifference of weather. The food you had brought had been depleted by the trail, and had to stretch through months during which the fields you intended to plant were still stumps and mud. The social world of the wagon train had dispersed across the valley to individual claims, and the community that had formed in motion now had to reform in place, more slowly and with more distance between its members. Some families found this harder than the trail, some found it easier. Almost all of them, by their first spring in Oregon, had made peace with the fact that what they had come to was not the end of difficulty, but the beginning of a different kind, the kind that could, with enough work and time and stubbornness, eventually become home. The Oregon Trail exacted a price that wasn't only measured in dollars, though it was measured in those too. Outfitting a wagon train cost between $500 and $1,000 in 1849, which was roughly a year's wages for a working family, and which most families spent by selling everything they owned and borrowing the rest. But the fuller accounting was harder to put into numbers. Historians estimate that somewhere between 20,000 and 30,000 people died on the Oregon Trail between 1841 and 1869, out of a total of approximately 300,000 who made the attempt. They died of disease, of accidents, of drowning, of exhaustion, of giving birth in a wagon on a mountain pass, of being buried in a grave on the road with a wooden marker that would be gone within a season. They died having come most of the way, or all of it, or barely any of it. They died alongside people they had known their whole lives and people they had met 3 weeks before, and they were buried where they fell, and the train moved on. The financial cost was front-loaded and total. Most emigrant families liquidated everything they had to fund the crossing. The farm sold, the furniture sold, the animals sold, the equipment sold, every asset converted to the cash that would buy the wagon, the oxen, the 5 months of supplies. You left with everything you had, which became the wagon and its contents, which became, by the time you reached Oregon, a depleted wagon, and whatever hadn't been abandoned at altitude. The land you claimed in Oregon was free in the legal sense and cost in the practical sense everything you had already spent to reach it, plus everything you would spend in the first years developing it. The math closed, eventually, for the families that survived and stayed. For the families that didn't, the math was simply open, an unclosed account. The emotional cost was harder to tabulate, and in some ways never was. The graves along the trail, estimated at roughly 10 to 15,000 marked and unmarked, spaced at the trail's documented rate of 1 death per 10 miles, represented families permanently reduced, children who finished the journey without parents, parents who arrived in Oregon carrying absences that no amount of Willamette Valley soil could fill. Trail journals that record deaths have a specific texture. The entry for the day of the death is careful and detailed, noting the name and the age and the cause and the circumstances of burial. Then there is often a day or two of silence in the journal, blank pages or missing dates. Then the entries resume, practical and forward-looking because the trail required it. The grief, was real. The trail didn't care. What the trail cost in terms of the lives already being lived in the places the emigrants came from is a different kind of accounting. The communities left behind, the churches and the neighbours and the extended families and the familiar landscapes were exchanged for Oregon, which was real but which was also, for the first years, largely theoretical. You had traded the concrete comfort of the known for the potential comfort of the not yet built, and the exchange rate was uncertain, and the delivery timeline was long, and the total cost was something you were still calculating years later, sitting on your Oregon claim in a cabin you had built yourself, looking at land you had walked 2,000 miles to reach. And yet they went. 300,000 of them, across nearly 3 decades, walking west in the footsteps of everyone who had come before, and leaving footsteps for everyone who came after. They went because the alternative was staying, and staying, in the specific circumstances of the specific lives they were living, had come to feel impossible in ways they could articulate and ways they couldn't. They went because the pamphlet said Oregon was worth it, and because the pamphlets were right about the soil and wrong about the difficulty and not wrong enough to stop anyone. They went because humans go, because the thing that distinguishes us across all of history from every other creature on the planet is the capacity to look at a 2,000-mile trail through territory we have never seen and decide that whatever is on the other side is worth finding out. They went, and they suffered, and they arrived, and they built. And the thing they built in the end was Oregon. So tonight, as you lie in your bed, your soft, stationary, blessedly motionless bed, take a moment to think about what those people carried. Not the flour barrels or the spare axle timber or the coffee grinder that somehow survived 2,000 miles when the rocking chair didn't. The other things, the ones that didn't weigh anything and couldn't be left on the roadside in Wyoming no matter how hard the oxen were struggling. The hope that the next place would be better than the last one. The stubborn, quietly irrational conviction that the distance between where you were and where you could be was something you could simply walk across if you were willing to walk long enough and hard enough and without looking back too often. They were not remarkable people, most of them. They were farmers and shopkeepers and young couples with children and old parents who probably should have stayed home and didn't. They were people who had made a decision under pressure with incomplete information and then spent 5 months finding out what the decision actually meant. They walked through dust that filled their lungs and rain that soaked everything they owned, and rivers that didn't always let everyone across. They buried people they loved in the road and kept going, because the road didn't offer any other option, and because Oregon was still there, still waiting, still worth it, or at least they needed to believe it was, and on the Oregon Trail, the need to believe something and the belief itself were close enough to the same thing to keep you moving. They lost furniture they had saved for years. They lost animals they had named. Some of them lost children, and some of them lost themselves. The people they had been in Missouri did not always arrive intact in Oregon, worn down and reshaped by 5 months of a journey that asked more than anyone had fully anticipated giving. And yet they built. On whatever they arrived with, in whatever condition they arrived in, they broke ground and felled timber and chinked log walls against the Oregon rain and planted the first crops in soil so rich it must have felt, after everything, like a small apology from the universe. They did not have memory foam, they did not have GPS or antibiotics or water you could drink without calculating the risk, or a single morning that started later than 4 o'clock. They had the wagon and the oxen and each other and the trail, and they made it work in the way that humans make impossible things work, imperfectly, expensively, with more loss than anyone planned for, and with a resilience so ordinary and so total that it didn't even have a name. It was just what you did. It was just what they did. So tonight, as you drift off in your quiet room, spare a thought for the woman who gave birth in a wagon on the far side of the Green River and was back on the trail the following morning, for the man who buried his ox on the Snake River plain and rigged the remaining team to keep pulling. For the child who walked 12 miles in wet shoes and didn't complain because everyone around her was doing the same thing. For the wagon master who made the wrong call at the crossing and kept leading anyway because someone had to. They were heading somewhere they had never seen, toward a life they could only imagine, through terrain that did not care whether they made it. And most of them did. They made it. They got to Oregon. Sleep well.